Hey guys, tonight we drift slowly into the watery heart of West Africa, exploring the Kanem-Bornu lake communities. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while we settle in, I'm curious, which country are you watching from, and what's the local time where you are? Think of this as a quiet, global late-night gathering, each of us lulled by the same imagined breeze over the lake. You probably won't survive the chaos of a bustling lake market, but you will survive the calm hum of early settlements. You picture yourself walking along shallow, muddy shores, feeling the cool water lap at your ankles. Papyrus reeds sway gently, and the scent of wet earth mixes with the faint tang of fish drying in the sun. Children laugh somewhere, chasing ducks or pecking at the mud to build little forts of their own. You notice women skillfully balancing clay pots on their heads, and fishermen hauling in nets that glisten with tiny, shimmering fish, their tails flicking water like silver sparks. Historians still argue whether these early settlements began as simple fishing hamlets or as carefully chosen defensive points along the lake's shifting edges. Either way, you sense the logic. Water provides food, roots, and protection, all in one. You imagine elders seated on woven mats, whispering stories of the lake's beginnings, of strange spirits said to guard its hidden corners, and of seasons that come and go without human permission. And yes, there's the practical side too. Crocodile dung sunscreen. Not a joke. Some accounts claim people rubbed it on their skin to repel insects. You wrinkle your nose and chuckle at that one, imagining yourself applying it, but the elders nod solemnly, as if this is perfectly reasonable. The houses themselves are low and rectangular, made of sun-baked mud bricks and reeds, with roofs thatched tightly to resist sudden rainstorms. You step lightly over narrow paths, watching children dart between the dwellings. Smoke rises in thin spirals from cooking fires, carrying the aroma of millet porridge and roasted fish. Life here is slow, deliberate, connected to the rhythm of the water. You sense a community constantly observing the lake, its moods, its generosity, its tempers. Even the most mundane acts, collecting water, tending to small gardens, repairing boats, feel significant when you remember that the lake sustains everything. You hear the subtle lapping of water against canoes in the distance, a gentle metronome marking each day. The wind shifts slightly, and you imagine it carrying whispers of centuries, stories layered like sediment beneath the clear surface. By dusk, the horizon melts into soft oranges and pinks, and you notice how the lake mirrors the sky so perfectly that it seems almost magical. You imagine early settlers pausing to watch, reflecting silently, perhaps wondering what the future holds. You feel it too, a small, quiet awe at how humans and nature intertwine. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake the next morning to the soft hum of life along the lake, the air thick with humidity and the faint scent of wet earth. You step out of your small mud brick hut and immediately feel the pulse of the lake beneath your bare feet, cool and reassuring, like the first sip of water after a long thirst. Fishermen are already out, balancing expertly on narrow dugout canoes, their nets dipping and rising with a hypnotic rhythm. You watch as a young boy tips over his tiny basket, sending silvery tilapia scattering back into the water, and can't help but smile at the gentle chaos of daily life. Fishing here isn't just a way to eat. It's a language, a ritual, a form of storytelling passed down through generations. You notice women on the shore, their fingers deftly weaving reeds into mats or traps, humming soft songs whose origins historians still argue about. Sometimes they sing in overlapping tones, creating a harmony that seems accidental yet purposeful, like the lake itself teaching them its own rhythm. You pick up a small, smooth stone and toss it into the water, counting the ripples as they spread, each one a tiny echo of centuries of daily life. The food culture revolves around the lake's generosity. You watch someone carefully prepare smoked fish over a low fire, while another crushes millet into flour with a rhythmic pounding motion. And yes, there are quirky techniques too. Some communities, according to certain accounts, sprinkle powdered bones into drying fish, believing it improves taste and preserves it longer. You wrinkle your nose, giggle, and decide that you'll politely stick to the smoked tilapia. Scholars still debate whether this was a widespread practice or just an isolated eccentricity, but it's fascinating to imagine nonetheless. Daily life extends far beyond food. You wander past reed huts where laundry flaps in the wind, children practice balancing on narrow logs over shallow inlets, and elders sit quietly, observing everything. There's an almost meditative quality to the chores here, each movement carefully calibrated to the needs of the lake. You even spot someone fashioning a crude sundial from sticks and shells, measuring time in increments that feel both practical and poetic. The lake itself is a mood shifter. When the wind rises, it flattens the water into a mirror, reflecting clouds and sky so perfectly that you can barely tell which way is up. When storms roll in, fishermen pull their boats to shore, and the entire community moves in synchronized urgency, packing nets, covering food, and securing homes. You feel a quiet tension in the air, an unspoken respect for nature's unpredictability. Historians still argue whether ancient communities experienced these patterns with as much precision as modern observers can, but the continuity of adaptation is undeniable. And then there are the markets, floating or otherwise, where the lake doubles as a highway and a gathering space. Women paddle canoes stacked with baskets of fish, grains, and vegetables, calling out to neighbors with playful urgency. You can almost smell the sweet, spicy mix of dried fish, fresh herbs, and sun-warmed millet. There's a subtle camaraderie in the exchanges, a shared understanding of the lake's mood, its generosity, and its occasional whims. You notice a fisherman tossing tiny pebbles into the water, watching how the ripples intersect, perhaps marking secret fishing spots only he knows. You wander farther, hearing the clatter of wooden oars and the splash of small nets. You pause to watch an older man balancing effortlessly on the edge of his canoe while threading a net, his face set in concentration so deep that even the lake seems to hold its breath. You wonder how many mornings like this he's seen, how many sunrises mirrored on this exact water. There's a sense of timelessness here, as if the lake quietly insists on patience, teaching you to move deliberately and appreciate each moment. Even mundane tasks, carrying water, mending reeds, sorting grains, feel ritualized, almost ceremonial. You start noticing patterns, the way the wind nudges canoes in a particular direction, the way shadows stretch along the shore, the precise moments when birds swoop low to snatch fish. Everything has its rhythm, and you can't help but sync your breathing to it. In a weird way, the lake teaches you calm, even as its waters are full of life, unpredictability, and tiny surprises at every turn. As the sun climbs, the day hums along, the gentle lap of water providing a constant, soothing soundtrack. You sit on the shore, dipping your fingers into the cool lake, watching the shimmer on the surface. There's something hypnotic about it, a rhythm older than the houses, older than the market, older than the first fisherman who ever paddled here. You catch a fleeting glance of a bird skimming the water, and you think, this is life. Simple and complex, all at once. The sun tilts lower now, and you follow the gentle sway of the lake toward the heart of the community, where trade and travel converge. Canoes glide silently across the water, some laden with baskets of fish, others stacked high with millet, pottery, or small crafted items. You notice the elegant balance required to navigate these floating highways. Fishermen and traders alike shift their weight subtly, leaning with the rhythm of the waves. You step lightly onto a narrow dock, feeling the subtle bounce beneath your feet, and suddenly the lake feels like a living marketplace, humming with purpose and energy. Trade here isn't just about survival, it's social glue, a daily affirmation of community and connection. You hear the splash of oars, the chatter of voices, the occasional laughter as a child's canoe drifts slightly off course. Women call to each other from neighboring boats, exchanging news along with goods. Historians still argue whether these floating markets were formally organized or simply evolved naturally from casual exchanges along the shore. But the effect is the same, a lively, intertwined network where everyone knows everyone. Canoe craftsmanship itself is a skill passed down through generations. You crouch to watch a master carve a narrow boat from a single tree trunk, each stroke deliberate, almost meditative. The wood curls away like ribbons, revealing the elegant shape beneath. Fringe accounts suggest some canoes were painted with symbolic patterns meant to bring luck or ward off mischievous spirits, though scholars aren't certain how widespread this was. You imagine the pride of launching a perfectly carved vessel onto the lake, the way it cuts through water with a smooth, confident glide. You drift along the main trade lanes, observing interactions that are as much ritual as they are commerce. Fishermen trade extra catch for spices, small jewelry or cloth. Children run errands, ferrying messages and baskets between canoes. Elders watch silently, nodding approval or offering subtle guidance. You spot someone bartering with tiny shells, a quirky remnant of older traditions, while another negotiates with a playful wink over a bundle of dried fish. These interactions feel choreographed by centuries of practice, a social dance that requires observation, intuition, and patience. The lake itself facilitates these connections. You notice hidden inlets and shallow coves, small enough for private exchanges or temporary moorings, and you imagine how traders of old learned the subtle geography by heart. Some scholars still debate the exact trade routes, wondering whether goods came from neighboring regions in a steady flow or sporadically, shaped by seasonal conditions and political pressures. You float past a particularly narrow channel, the banks lined with papyrus, imagining the early traders who first mapped these watery paths with only instinct and experience. Floating markets here are sensory overload in the best possible way. You inhale the mingled scents of drying fish, fresh herbs, sun-baked millet, and smoke from cooking fires, all blending with the earthy aroma of the water. You hear the rhythmic slap of paddles, the creak of wood, and the occasional splash of a fish leaping out of a net. Children squeal with delight as they balance small canoes or chase birds, and you can't help but grin at their fearless energy. The water itself is part of every transaction, carrying messages, goods, and laughter across distances that would take hours on foot. Then there's the playful, almost theatrical side of trade. One trader pretends to stumble, scattering beans across his canoe, only to wink and scoop them up, delighting onlookers. You imagine early settlements full of these small dramas, where humour is part of the survival toolkit. Historians still argue whether some of these customs were purely practical or infused with symbolic meaning, but watching it unfold, the lines blur beautifully. You paddle a bit farther, noticing small flags tied to canoes, probably marking ownership or signalling readiness to trade. A woman laughs as she flips a small basket, sending grains tumbling, and another yells mock outrage from across the water. The lake seems to amplify these interactions, each sound carrying farther, each ripple a tiny echo of centuries of commerce. You feel both grounded and light, carried along by this symphony of water, wood, and human endeavour. As the sun begins its slow descent, the light dances across the water in long, golden streaks. You pause, letting the gentle motion of your canoe lull your senses. Floating markets are not just economic centers. They are living classrooms, rehearsals for social life, and celebrations of community ingenuity. You realize that each paddle stroke, each trade, each laugh is a thread in the larger tapestry of lake life, weaving together survival, culture, and joy in equal measure. Even as the floating markets settle into a lazy afternoon rhythm, you sense another layer of life beneath the lake's surface, a world of stories, spirits, and legends that locals whisper about in hushed tones. You squat at the water's edge, dipping your fingers in, and the surface seems ordinary at first, yet you can almost imagine the myths swimming just below. Tales of giant serpents, protective water spirits, and mischievous lake creatures float through the air as easily as the scent of smoked fish. You probably won't survive a direct encounter with some of these spirits, but it's far safer and strangely comforting to imagine them from a respectful distance. The elders claim the lake has memory, that it holds the echoes of every settlement, every boat, and every storm it has ever witnessed. Children huddle close, wide-eyed, as stories unfold, a fisherman lured into a whirlpool by a playful water spirit, or a village saved when a mysterious fog hid it from raiders. Fringe accounts even suggest some communities would leave offerings of millet or fish at certain inlets, believing this would appease unseen guardians. Scholars still argue whether these rituals were widely practiced or isolated traditions, but you can't help feeling a gentle thrill imagining the lake as a sentient, watchful presence. You wander past a reed hut where an elder demonstrates a curious divination practice, dipping a carved wooden figurine into the water and watching how it floats or tilts. The subtle tilt of the figure supposedly predicts the success of a fishing expedition or the likelihood of rain. You chuckle softly, but then think about the centuries of knowledge encoded in these seemingly simple gestures. Even if some details are lost or exaggerated over time, the lake clearly shapes not only survival, but imagination, belief, and behavior. The local myths aren't just bedtime tales. They influence daily life in practical ways. Boats might avoid certain coves thought to be inhabited by spirits, and fishermen sometimes chant softly to honor unseen forces before casting nets. You notice these rituals are quietly woven into every action, almost invisible to the untrained eye, yet ever present. You step lightly across a wooden plank and imagine a similar ritual hundreds of years ago, a silent pact between humans and the lake. Historians still debate the origins of some of these legends, whether they predate the communities themselves or evolved alongside them, but the stories remain deeply rooted in the culture. And then there are the peculiar, almost whimsical practices, like the belief that certain fish carry messages from ancestors, or that spotting a rare bird signals a good harvest. You tilt your head at these ideas, smiling at the playful logic behind them, while noting that such beliefs were often intertwined with survival strategies, like knowing which fish are safer to eat, or which weather patterns to heed. Fringe or not, these notions reflect a creative, intimate understanding of the environment. Walking along the marshy edges, you spot faint carvings on trees and rocks, symbols and figures whose meanings are partially lost. Some say these were made to guide spirits, others claim they marked fishing territories. Scholars still argue whether they were spiritual, practical, or both. You imagine the hands that carved them, patient and deliberate, each line a bridge between the mundane and the mystical. Even the lake's temperament seems to echo the myths. A sudden gust ripples the surface, sending soft waves toward your ankles, and you can't help but imagine it as a sigh of the spirits, acknowledging your presence. You watch as a group of children play near a small inlet, daring each other to touch a submerged stone rumored to be enchanted. You grin at their courage and think about how belief, imagination, and reality coexist seamlessly here. As the sun drifts lower, The lake glows in soft amber tones. Shadows of papyrus sway lazily, birds settle in the reeds, and the distant hum of the marketplace fades. You take a deep breath, feeling the lake's calm but potent presence, and realize that for centuries, myths and legends have shaped more than stories. They've guided behavior, taught caution, and nurtured a sense of wonder. Even today, the lake's mysterious heartbeat is palpable, a silent teacher of both awe and humility. You pause, letting your thoughts drift, sensing that every ripple could carry a story, every shimmer could hide a secret, and that living here is as much about navigating belief as it is about navigating water. You feel a connection to countless ancestors who stood here, listening to the whispers of wind, water, and spirits, slowly learning the lake's language. The next morning, you awaken to a subtle shift in the air, a heavier scent of wet earth, hinting that the weather is changing. The lake's surface is no longer calm, small ripples chase each other in a restless dance, and you notice fishermen adjusting their nets and canoes, anticipating the moods of the water. Life along the lake has always been intertwined with climate, droughts, sudden storms, and seasonal floods dictate not just survival, but when to plant crops, fish, or trade. You probably won't survive the sudden, unpredicted floods if you're unprepared, but watching the community adapt is mesmerizing. Historians still argue whether certain extreme weather events happened every decade or sporadically. But one thing is clear: the people of Kanem-Bornu have learned to read the lake like a living calendar. You follow a small group of women as they haul baskets of millet toward higher ground, their bare feet gripping slippery mud, and you can feel the collective resilience in every step. It's not just physical, it's cultural memory encoded in daily action, passed from one generation to the next. You notice unusual strategies, almost eccentric to an outsider. Some families build floating garden platforms with reeds, planting vegetables that rise and fall with the water level. Others fashion temporary fish traps from clay and twine, designed to work even when the lake swells unexpectedly. You raise an eyebrow at one particularly inventive system: tiny cork floats attached to each trap, bobbing like playful spirits on the water. Scholars still debate how widespread these floating gardens were, or if they were experimental attempts by only a few resourceful households, but the creativity is undeniable. Beyond practical adaptation, you see that environmental shifts influence social life too. Elders convene to discuss the year's fishing and planting schedule, children learn early how to judge the water's rise by observing birds and reeds, and families sometimes relocate temporarily to higher ground. You feel the pulse of a society tuned into the subtle cues of the natural world, where intuition and observation are as vital as labor. Fringe accounts suggest some communities even performed ceremonial dances to invoke rain or ward off floods, blurring the line between spirituality and practical knowledge. Walking along a narrow bank, you see small boats tethered together to form makeshift platforms. On these, families repair nets, smoke fish, or simply rest while the lake's ripples lap against their feet. You notice that people rarely rush. The lake demands patience, a lesson ingrained over centuries. Even the architecture responds. Houses are elevated on stilts or built with temporary extensions that can be dismantled when water levels rise. You marvel at the ingenuity, imagining how many mornings were spent testing these systems and adjusting them with trial and error. You catch a faint shimmer on the horizon, and the sky darkens slightly. Storm clouds gather, promising rain and sudden gusts of wind. You feel the subtle tension in the air, a collective awareness that the lake can shift from nurturing to challenging in a matter of hours. Children laugh nervously, daring each other to leap across puddles forming along the pathways, while elders glance toward the heavens with calm, knowing expressions. The interplay of human activity and environmental unpredictability is mesmerizing, sometimes almost comical in its improvisation, yet always grounded in serious survival needs. As rain begins to patter gently on reeds and mud, you see people pulling floating gardens closer to the shore, tying canoes and securing food stores. You notice a young boy testing the floating platforms like a small, delighted scientist, observing which ones rise higher or sway less. The mixture of play, learning, and work is seamless, a reflection of a culture shaped by water, weather, and ingenuity. Historians still argue whether the techniques used today mirror those of centuries past or evolved gradually, but the spirit of adaptation feels timeless. Even the smallest details matter here: a reed bundle tied a certain way, a canoe weighted just so, a communal chant to encourage steady winds. You sense that life is a continuous negotiation with the environment, and the lake is both teacher and partner. You pause on a muddy bank, letting the gentle rain soak your hair, feeling the lake's pulse synchronize with your own. In this delicate balance, humor and pragmatism coexist. Someone slips, sending water splashing over their neighbor, eliciting laughter, a reminder that survival need not be solemn all the time. As the sun begins to break through scattered clouds, golden light glimmers on rippling water, illuminating the community's resilient choreography. You realize that climate shifts aren't just challenges, they are catalysts for innovation, cooperation, and storytelling. Each flood or drought leaves behind lessons etched into memory, guiding generations. You take a deep breath, letting the scent of wet earth and fish mingle with the warmth of sunlight, appreciating the delicate, enduring dance between humans and the lake. As the lake settles after the rain, you feel the atmosphere soften, as if the water itself is exhaling. This is when belief quietly steps forward. Not announced, not dramatic, just present in the way people move and speak. You walk past a small gathering near the shore where a circle has formed, feet planted firmly in damp sand, faces calm and focused. Religion here is not confined to buildings or strict schedules. It flows like the lake, slipping into daily life wherever it finds space. You notice simple objects arranged carefully: a clay bowl filled with water, a few reeds tied together, a small carved figure smoothed by years of handling. Someone murmurs a low chant, barely louder than the breeze. These are not grand ceremonies meant to impress. They are intimate, functional, designed to keep harmony between people, water, and whatever unseen forces might be listening. Historians still argue whether these rituals predate organized religion in the region or evolved alongside later Islamic influences, but standing here, the blend feels natural rather than conflicted. You kneel beside the water as an elder scoops up a handful, letting it drip slowly back into the lake. The gesture is said to bring balance, especially before long fishing trips. Fringe traditions even suggest that the first catch of the day was sometimes released back into the lake as a sign of respect. You imagine the internal struggle, giving up perfectly good fish in hopes of future abundance, and quietly admire the discipline behind it. The lake is sacred, but not in a distant, untouchable way. It's sacred like a shared hearth, something you depend on daily. You see people washing their hands and faces before entering canoes, a small act that blends hygiene with reverence. Children are taught early not to shout unnecessarily on the water, as loud noises might offend spirits or disturb the lake's balance. You smirk slightly at this, thinking how useful that rule is for maintaining peace regardless of spiritual beliefs. As the sun climbs, the call to prayer drifts across the water from a nearby settlement, soft and melodic. Some pause their work, others continue quietly, listening while tying nets or mending reeds. The coexistence is seamless, older lake-based beliefs sitting comfortably alongside Islam, neither fully replacing the other. Scholars still debate how this balance was negotiated historically, whether through gradual integration or deliberate compromise, But the result is a layered spiritual life that feels deeply grounded. You follow a narrow path to a shaded area where a seasonal ritual is taking place. It's not flashy, no masks, no dramatic drums, just rhythmic clapping and a low, steady chant meant to ask for calm waters in the coming weeks. Someone sprinkles water onto the ground, darkening the dust. You notice how even skepticism is welcome here. Participation is gentle, optional, and respectful. You think to yourself that this might be the most relaxed religious environment you've ever imagined, which feels oddly refreshing. There are stranger beliefs too, the kind whispered rather than announced. Some say certain whirlpools are doorways, not dangerous exactly, just selective. Others believe that dreams after sleeping near the lake carry messages, though historians still argue whether these interpretations were symbolic or taken quite literally. You picture someone waking from a vivid dream and deciding to delay a fishing trip, just in case, and you can't help but think that intuition dressed as spirituality can be surprisingly effective. As evening approaches, small fires appear along the shore. People gather, sharing food and quiet conversation, the lake reflecting flickering orange light. Someone tells a gentle joke about a spirit that supposedly fell asleep and forgot to stir the winds, earning a few tired laughs. Humor, it seems, is part of devotion here, a way of acknowledging uncertainty without fear. You sit near the water, listening to overlapping sounds, soft prayer, crackling firewood, distant frogs beginning their nightly chorus. Religion here doesn't demand attention, it offers comfort. It reminds people that not everything needs to be controlled, that some things are meant to be respected, observed, and gently negotiated with. You feel that calm settle into you, like warmth spreading from the fire as the lake darkens and the stars begin to emerge. Night thins into early morning, and with it comes a quieter, more watchful energy. You sense it before you see it, the way people glance across the water a little longer than usual, the way voices lower when certain paths are mentioned. The lake is generous, yes, but it has also been a frontier, and where resources gather, so does conflict. You walk along the shoreline and notice low earthworks half swallowed by grass, barely noticeable unless you know to look. These are remnants of old defences. Modest forts meant less for dramatic warfare and more for warning and delay. Kanem-Bornu's power once stretched far beyond the lake, and this water-linked world was never as isolated as it might seem. Mainstream history agrees that the Kanem-Bornu Empire was a major regional force for centuries, controlling trade routes and projecting authority across vast distances. You imagine small patrol boats gliding quietly at dawn, not looking for battle but for signs, unfamiliar canoes, disturbed reeds, smoke where none should be. Historians still argue how frequent actual armed clashes were along the lake itself, but the constant readiness tells its own story. You crouch near a raised mound where wooden posts once stood, forming a lookout. From here, the view stretches wide, and you realize how perfectly the lake serves as both shield and vulnerability. Water slows attackers, but also carries them. Fringe accounts claim some communities strung hidden reed barriers just beneath the surface to snag unfamiliar boats, though scholars aren't certain whether this was common practice or clever improvisation remembered as legend. Either way, you imagine the anxiety of watching shadows move across the water at night, every ripple a possible threat. Conflicts here were rarely grand cinematic battles. They were skirmishes, raids, tense standoffs that ended as quickly as they began. You picture people scrambling to secure canoes, children ushered into huts, elders gripping staffs not meant for fighting but for authority. The goal wasn't conquest, it was survival, deterrence, and protecting access to the lake's resources. You probably wouldn't survive one of these sudden night alarms without tripping over a reed basket, but the community's coordination is impressive, even soothing in its efficiency. You notice how architecture adapts to this reality. Settlements are clustered just close enough for mutual aid, yet spaced to avoid total disaster if one area is attacked. Canoes are kept ready, not just for fishing, but for evacuation or rapid communication. Drums, usually reserved for celebration, double as warning signals, their rhythms changing meaning depending on speed and pattern. Historians still argue how standardized these signals were, but the lake clearly carried sound far enough to make them effective. As you walk farther, you find an old weapon half buried in mud, a simple spearhead, rusted and worn. It's unassuming, almost disappointing if you expected something dramatic, but this is what defense looks like here: practical, minimal, and purposeful. There's no glory in it, only responsibility. You imagine the hands that once held it, steady but reluctant, hoping never to need it. There's humor too, even in danger. Someone jokes about mistaking a drifting log for an invading canoe, earning tired laughs that break the tension. Another tells a story about a supposed raid that turned out to be lost traders who brought extra fish as apology. These stories soften the memory of fear, turning it into something manageable, something human. As daylight strengthens, the sense of threat fades back into routine. Nets are repaired, fires rekindled, and children resume their games near the water's edge. You realize that conflict here is not a constant state, but a remembered possibility, shaping behavior without dominating it. The lake remains calm, indifferent to human disputes, reflecting the sky with quiet patience. You stand still for a moment, feeling the weight of history settle gently rather than heavily. Defense, here, is less about walls and weapons and more about awareness, cooperation, and respect for the lake's role as both protector and pathway. You take a slow breath, letting that understanding sink in as the water laps softly at the shore, already preparing to carry you forward into the next layer of life. As the tension of watchfulness dissolves, something lighter takes its place, almost playful, drifting in with the late afternoon breeze. You hear it before you see it, a soft rhythm tapped on wood, the low hum of a voice testing a melody. Art here doesn't announce itself as art. It simply happens, woven into moments of rest, repair, and reflection. You wander closer to the sound and find a small group gathered near the water, feet dangling over the edge, letting the lake listen too. Music in the lake communities is portable, practical, and deeply social. Instruments are light enough to carry in a canoe, small drums, hollowed gourds strung with beads, simple stringed instruments carved from wood and animal hide. You watch someone tune a lute-like instrument, tightening the string with patient care. Mainstream history agrees that oral traditions were central to Kanem-Bornu culture, carrying history, law, and moral lessons through song. You realize that in a place where water reshapes the land, memory needs to travel just as fluidly. A song begins, slow and repetitive, designed less to impress and more to soothe. The melody rolls gently, like waves lapping a canoe. A singer recounts the journey of an ancestor who followed the lake during a long drought, finding safety where the reeds grew thickest. Historians still argue how literally these songs should be interpreted, whether they record actual migrations or symbolize resilience, but the emotion feels unmistakably real. You catch yourself swaying slightly, breathing in time with the rhythm. Storytelling follows music as naturally as night follows dusk. An elder clears his throat and begins a tale, not standing, not performing, just speaking as if remembering out loud. Children lean in, already knowing the ending, but listening anyway. You hear stories of clever fishermen who outwitted spirits, of foolish traders who ignored advice, of heroic acts that are deliberately understated. There's humor here too. Someone interrupts to correct a detail, sparking laughter and a mock argument about whose version is true. Scholarly uncertainty lives comfortably here, multiple versions coexist without trouble. Visual art is quieter, but everywhere. You notice patterns carved into paddles, repeating shapes painted on pottery, subtle designs braided into mats. Some symbols are said to represent water levels or fishing luck. Others are purely decorative. Fringe interpretations claim certain patterns acted as mnemonic devices, helping storytellers remember long narratives. Scholars aren't sure, but you can see how repetition and rhythm, visual and auditory, work together to anchor memory. Children practice their own versions of these traditions. You spot a group acting out a story with exaggerated gestures, using sticks as paddles and reeds as imaginary fish. One child dramatically falls into the lake, earning groans and laughter. You smile, thinking how culture survives best when it's playful, when it invites participation rather than reverence alone. You probably wouldn't survive trying to perform in front of this crowd without forgetting your lines, but the encouragement here is gentle and forgiving. As evening approaches, the lake reflects streaks of purple and gold. Someone begins a rhythm on a drum meant for rowing songs, steady, unhurried, ideal for long journeys across water. The beat isn't loud, it's reassuring, like a heartbeat. You imagine canoes moving in unison, paddles dipping together, guided as much by sound as by sight. Historians still argue whether these songs were standardized across the region or varied from community to community, but the purpose is clear. Connection. You sit back, letting the sounds wash over you. Art here doesn't demand attention, it invites rest. It fills the spaces between labor and sleep, between memory and imagination. The lake listens without judgment, carrying echoes of songs long after voices fade. You feel that same echo settling into you, a reminder that history isn't only written in events and dates, but in melodies, laughter, and the quiet confidence of stories told well and often. Morning arrives with a different kind of stillness, one edged with curiosity and caution. You notice it in the way people pause when unfamiliar canoes appear on the horizon, their shapes just slightly wrong, their movements unfamiliar. This is the era of new encounters, when outsiders begin to drift into the lake world, not as conquerors at first, but as traders, observers, and quiet disruptors. You stand near the shore and watch these boats approach, their occupants scanning the water as if trying to read a language they don't yet understand. Mainstream history tells us that by the 19th century, European explorers and colonial agents were moving through the broader Lake Chad region, drawn by trade routes, strategic positioning, and imperial curiosity. You imagine the first conversations, awkward, cautious, filled with gestures and half-translated phrases. Goods are exchanged, cloth, metal tools, unfamiliar trinkets. Some are welcomed for their usefulness, others are regarded with polite suspicion. Historians still argue how much direct influence these early encounters had on everyday lake life at first, but change rarely announces itself loudly. You walk through the community and notice subtle shifts. Metal hooks replace some bone ones. Certain boats are reinforced differently. New trade pressures encourage larger catches, longer journeys. On the surface, these are small adjustments, but you can feel the undercurrent pulling traditions in new directions. Fringe accounts even suggest that some elders deliberately restricted contact, steering traders toward specific docks to limit cultural disruption. Whether that level of control was truly possible is debated, but the intent to protect balance is unmistakable. Colonial administration eventually brings more formal changes. Borders are drawn far from the lake's edge, yet their effects ripple inward. Taxes, new authorities, and unfamiliar rules arrive, sometimes enforced by people who don't fish, don't paddle, and don't listen to the lake. You sense the tension this creates. The water ignores borders, but people are suddenly asked to respect them. Historians still argue how deeply these imposed systems penetrated daily lake routines, but the discomfort is easy to imagine. You hear stories of adaptation rather than collapse. Communities adjust trade routes, shift seasonal movements, and learn when to engage and when to withdraw. Some embrace new opportunities, expanded markets, access to broader networks, while others quietly maintain older rhythms beneath the surface of compliance. You spot a fisherman using a metal tool while still whispering the same precast chant his grandfather used. Continuity and change sit side by side, neither fully winning. Modern times creep in slowly. Radios appear, crackling softly in the evenings. Outboard motors replace paddles on some boats, though many still prefer the silence of wood and water. Education introduces new ideas, new aspirations, and new distances from the lake. You watch a child practice writing in the sand with a stick, pausing occasionally to glance at the water, torn between futures. Scholars still debate whether modernization weakened lake-based identities or simply reshaped them. But standing here, the connection feels resilient rather than fragile. You also sense loss. Shrinking water levels, political instability, and economic pressures make life harder. Some families leave, seeking steadier ground elsewhere. Others stay, adapting once again. There's humor even here, jokes about engines failing at the worst moment, or radios only working during storms. Laughter becomes a survival tool, a way to keep continuity alive when certainty fades. As evening settles, you watch modern lights flicker alongside cooking fires, reflections mingling on the water's surface. The lake holds them all, the old and the new, without preference. You feel a quiet respect for a culture that absorbs change without forgetting itself, that negotiates with modernity the same way it negotiates with weather, cautiously, creatively, and together. You feel the pace slow naturally now, not because anyone tells it to, but because the lake itself seems to ease its grip on the day. The final light of afternoon stretches long and low across the water, and you sense how continuity lives here, not as resistance to change, but as quiet persistence. People move with practiced familiarity, adjusting nets, tying boats, greeting neighbors with nods that carry years of shared understanding. Life continues. Not dramatically, not loudly, just steadily. You notice how modern routines sit gently atop older ones. A solar panel leans against a mud wall, charging a small lamp for the evening, while nearby an elder teaches a child how to judge water depth by the color of reeds. Mainstream history agrees that despite political shifts and environmental pressure, lake communities around Kanem-Bornu have maintained a remarkable degree of cultural continuity. You see it in posture, in timing, in the way people still pause before pushing a canoe into the water, acknowledging the lake as partner rather than tool. There are uncertainties now, openly acknowledged. Water levels fluctuate more dramatically than elders remember. Fish populations shift. Younger generations leave and return, sometimes changed. Historians still argue whether these pressures represent a breaking point or simply another chapter in a long pattern of adaptation. You stand on the shore, watching a fisherman test the water with his paddle, and you realize that uncertainty has always been part of this life. It's not feared, it's expected. Quirky habits remain too. Someone insists on launching their canoe only after circling it once, a habit nobody can fully explain. Another refuses to fish on certain days, guided by dreams rather than calendars. You smile at these details, understanding that continuity is often preserved in small, stubborn choices. You probably wouldn't survive trying to memorize all these unwritten rules, but living among them feels oddly reassuring. As evening deepens, cooking fires dot the shoreline again, mirroring the stars beginning to appear above. Conversation softens. Laughter becomes gentler, more spaced out. The lake reflects everything: firelight, moonlight, memory without commentary. You feel yourself slowing with it, your thoughts drifting wider, calmer. And now, without a sharp boundary, the story loosens its grip and becomes something else entirely. The lake darkens to deep blue, then almost black, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple. Fires burn down to glowing embers, orange and red breathing quietly in the night air. You imagine sitting close to one, warmth touching your skin, the crackle of wood blending with distant water sounds. The voices around you fade, not abruptly, but the way conversations do when sleep approaches. Someone stirs the embers, sending a brief spray of sparks upward like tiny stars returning home. The lake answers with a soft lap against the shore, steady and patient. Longer shadows stretch, then dissolve. The world feels held, as if wrapped in something familiar and kind. Your breathing slows. The history you've walked through no longer feels like information, but like atmosphere, something you can rest inside. The lake is no longer something to understand or analyze. It's simply there, wide and calm, carrying centuries quietly beneath its surface. You let the images blur, canoes becoming silhouettes, reeds merging into darkness, embers dimming to a gentle glow. The lake remains, watching, breathing, unchanged by your presence, yet welcoming of it. And as the night settles fully, you feel safe letting go, drifting the way the water does, unhurried and unafraid, into sleep. Sweet dreams.